Welcome to Sleepy Beep. Tonight, we are going to slow down together and spend some time with a single, very old idea, the idea of power. Not power as the loud word you might expect, not the kind that fills boardrooms and battlefields, but power as the quiet thing it actually is when you look closely. Power in ordinary life, the kind that moves through your days so softly you may never have noticed it was there at all. You do not need to know anything about philosophy to listen tonight. You do not need to have read a single book, or to remember any names, or to understand a single difficult word. If a name comes up, I will say who they were. If an idea comes up, I will explain it gently, the way you might explain something to a friend who is half asleep beside you. There is nothing here to study, there is nothing to figure out, and there is nowhere else you need to be. You can let the words wash over you and drift wherever they please. That is exactly what they are for. If you feel like it, before your eyes grow too heavy, you might share in the comments what time it is, where you are, and where you are listening from tonight. It is a small thing, but it is a kind thing. To know that all over the world in all these different hours, there are people lying in the dark, listening to the same quiet voice, settling in together. Some of you are listening just after midnight, some of you in the small hours before dawn, some of you in the early evening, the light still fading at the window. Wherever you are, whatever hour it is, you are welcome here. So take a slow, deep breath now. In through the nose, gently, and let it go all the way out, slowly. Let your shoulders fall a little further from your ears. Let the back of your head grow heavy against the pillow. Wherever you are, let yourself settle in. There is no hurry. There has never been any hurry, not really. We have all the time in the world and we are going nowhere fast. Thank you for joining us here at Sleepy Beep. Let us begin. There is a feeling that comes to almost everyone, sooner or later, usually in the quiet of a night, much like this one. It is the feeling of being powerless. The feeling that somewhere in your life, in some corner of it, you do not have the say you wish you had. Perhaps it lives at work, in a meeting where your idea was passed over, or where someone louder than you took the room and you sat there, knowing you were right and saying nothing. Perhaps it lives in love, in the ache of caring more than you are cared for, or in the strange smallness you feel when you want something from someone and you do not know how to ask. Perhaps it lives among friends, in the way the group seems to bend around certain people and not around you, and you cannot quite name why. If you have ever felt that, and I think nearly everyone has in one form or another, then I want you to know right at the start that this feeling is not a flaw in you. It is not a sign that you are weak or that you have failed at some game everyone else has secretly mastered. It is one of the oldest human experiences there is. People have been lying awake with exactly this feeling for thousands of years. The very greatest thinkers who ever lived, the ones whose names have survived for centuries, spent their lives circling this one question. What is power really? And do I have any? That is the question we are going to rest inside tonight. Not to solve it, the way you would solve a problem, but to walk around it slowly in the dark until it begins to feel less frightening, until it begins perhaps to feel like an old friend rather than an old wound. And I want to tell you something now near the beginning that the rest of the night will gently prove. Almost everything you have ever been told about power is the loud half of the story. There is a whole industry built on the loud half, on schemes and tactics, on how to control other people, how to win, how to come out on top, how to make others do what you want. The shelves are full of it, the cynical reading, power as domination, power as a cold thing you take from someone else. But there is another half, a quieter half, and the strange, beautiful secret, the thing the noise tends to drown out, is that the deepest thinkers on power, the ones we will visit tonight, mostly pointed toward this quieter half. When you read them carefully past the caricatures, they do not say that real power is loud. They say again and again, in their different voices across the centuries, that the truest and most lasting power is quiet, and that it does not begin out there with other people. It begins here, inside you. That is the river we are going to float down tonight. Let me give it a name, so you have something gentle to hold on to as we drift. There are, when you look closely, two kinds of power, and once you can see the two of them clearly, a great deal of the confusion falls away. The first kind is power over others. This is the kind everyone thinks of first. It is the manager who can tell you what to do, the person in the relationship who holds all the cards. The friend everyone is a little afraid of disappointing. It is the ability to make another person act or stop acting according to your will. Power over. We could call it that. Power over. It points outward at other people, and it works, in a way, but it has a hidden cost, and we will come to that cost later tonight very gently, because it is one of the most surprising and soothing things in this whole story. The second kind is power over yourself. This is the quieter kind, the kind that gets so much less attention, because it is harder to see and impossible to sell. It is the power to stay calm when something inside you wants to panic. The power to not say the cutting thing you could say. The power to want something and not be ruled by the wanting. The power to be hurt and not let the hurt run your life. The power to govern your own attention, your own fear, your own resentment. This kind points inward. It does not depend on anyone else at all. No one can take it from you because no one ever gave it to you. It was always yours. A thinker named Hannah Arendt, she was a philosopher who lived in the last century and thought very deeply about what power actually is, drew a line very much like this one. She made a distinction between what she called power over and what she called power to. Power over is the ability to dominate, to coerce, to force. But power to, she said, is something different and something more alive. It is the simple capacity to act, to begin something, to be the kind of person from whom things flow into the world. And she believed that real power, true power, was much closer to that second thing. Not the cold pressure of forcing someone, but the warm, living ability to act, often arising among people who come together, rather than from one person standing over the rest. You do not need to hold any of that too tightly. Let me say it again in the simplest possible way, the way you might remember it half asleep. There is power over others, and there is power over yourself. One points out, one points in. And the whole long, quiet wisdom of the centuries leans gently toward the one that points in. Now, I want to tell you a story to carry you a little deeper. Not a made-up story, a true one about a real man who lived a very long time ago and who happens to be one of the most striking proofs of everything I have just said. There was once a man who held more power over others than almost anyone who has ever lived. He was the Emperor of Rome. At the height of the Roman Empire, this meant that he ruled over a world that stretched from the cold rivers of the north to the deserts of the south. Millions of lives, in a sense, rested in his hands. A single word from him could move armies across continents. A single decision could change the fate of entire peoples. If there has ever been such a thing as power over others in its purest, most enormous form, this man held it. His name was Marcus Aurelius. And here is the thing I want you to rest on tonight. Here is the strange and wonderful fact at the heart of his life. This man, the most powerful man in the entire known world, a man who could have spent his private hours doing anything, commanding anyone, indulging in anything he wished, spent his nights by lamplight writing in a small, private journal. And he was not writing about how to control others. He was not making lists of enemies or plotting how to expand his power or recording his triumphs. He wrote almost entirely about how to control himself. We still have that journal today. It survived the centuries somehow, this private book a man wrote only for his own eyes, never meaning anyone else to read it. We call it the Meditations. And when you open it, you do not find the words of an emperor barking orders at the world. You find the words of a tired, thoughtful man talking quietly to himself in the dark, trying to be a little better, a little calmer, a little more patient than he was the day before. He wrote reminders to himself, reminders to wake in the morning and not dread the day's work, reminders to be patient with difficult people because they too were only doing what seemed right to them, reminders not to be ruled by anger, not to be swept away by grief, not to chase the praise of the crowd or to be wounded by their scorn. He wrote again and again about the only kingdom he truly believed he could rule, the small, quiet kingdom of his own mind. Sit with that for a moment in the warm dark. The most powerful man alive who could command anyone decided that the work that mattered most was the work of commanding himself. He had power over others on a scale we can barely imagine, and he came to believe, privately, in the silence of his own nights, that this was not the power that counted. The power that counted was the other kind, the kind that points inward, the kind that no army, no crown, no empire could give him, and that no defeat, no betrayal, no loss could take away. Why would a man like that, who had everything the loud world calls power, turn so completely toward the quiet kind? I think the answer is the gentlest possible answer, and it is this: because he had learned from the inside what the rest of us only suspect. He had learned that power over others is never as solid as it looks. Empires rise and fall. Loyalties shift. The crowd that cheers you today forgets you tomorrow. Fortune gives and fortune takes. A man who builds his whole sense of himself on power over others is building on sand, because all of it can be swept away by things he does not control. But the man who has learned to govern himself, to meet whatever comes with steadiness, to keep his own mind clear when the world goes mad, that man has built on rock. Nothing outside him can reach the place where he truly lives, and so the most powerful man in the world spent his nights not ruling, but learning to rest inside himself, which is, in a way, exactly what you are doing right now. Lying here in the dark, letting go of the day, settling into the only kingdom that is truly yours. This is what the whole night is offering you, not a set of tricks for controlling other people, not a way to win, something gentler and far more durable, the slow, kind understanding that the power that matters most was inside you all along, that you do not have to seize it or fight for it or take it from anyone. You only have to come home to it, the way you are coming home to your own breath, your own warmth, your own quiet, right now. So let us pause here for a moment, you and I. There is no need to hold any of this in your mind. If it has already begun to blur and soften, that is good. That is exactly as it should be. Take a slow, deep breath in gently and let it go slowly all the way out. Feel the weight of your body against the bed, against the pillow. The simple, honest heaviness of a body that is allowed, at last, to rest. Notice how the room holds you. Notice the quiet. There is nothing you need to do with any of it. There is nothing to figure out, and nowhere else to be. You have arrived exactly where you are meant to be tonight.
And when you are ready, and no hurry at all, we will continue together and travel a little further back in time to an old strategist who taught that the very greatest victory is the one you never have to fight for at all. Breathe, settle. We are going nowhere fast.
For now, let the idea of Marcus by his lamp stay with you like a small, warm light somewhere at the edge of sleep. The most powerful man in the world, choosing every night to rule only himself, and finding, in that small, quiet kingdom, the only power that no one could ever take away. There is something deeply restful in that, I think, because it means the work is not out there in the cold and the noise and the striving. The work is here. It is close. It is as close as your own breath. And it is gentle work, the gentlest work there is. The slow, patient, kind business of coming home to yourself. You are doing it now, just by lying here, just by letting the day fall away, just by listening in the dark to a story about a man who learned 2,000 years ago the thing you are quietly learning tonight. Let your breath grow slower still. Let the thoughts that come simply pass, the way clouds pass over a still pond, leaving the water underneath untouched. You do not have to follow them. You do not have to fight them. You only have to let them drift by while you stay here, soft and heavy and warm, in the only place that was ever truly yours. And as you rest, let me say it one more time, very softly, so it can sink down past your thinking and settle somewhere deeper. There are two kinds of power: the power over others, which is loud and which can always be taken away, and the power over yourself, which is quiet and which no one can ever touch. The whole long wisdom of the ages, the voices we will meet tonight, all of them lean toward the second, toward the quiet, toward the inward, toward the kind of strength that asks nothing of anyone and needs nothing from the world because it has come home to itself. That is the river we are floating down. And you are already further along it than you know. So rest now. Let yourself be carried. We will go on together in a little while gently toward the old strategist and his strange, beautiful teaching that the master of war is the one who never has to draw the sword. But there is no rush to get there. There is no rush to get anywhere at all. Just breathe. Just be here. Just let the dark hold you the way it has always known how. Let us pause here for a moment. There is nothing you need to do with what I have just said. You do not have to remember it or agree with it or even keep listening closely. The words can wash over you. Some of them will stay, most of them will not. That is exactly as it should be. Take a slow, deep breath. Notice the weight of your body against the bed, the way the mattress holds you, the way you do not have to hold yourself up at all, right now. And when you are ready, with no hurry, we will continue together. Welcome to Sleepy Beep. I am glad you are here in the quiet, wherever you are. If you feel like it, you might leave a small note before you drift off, telling us what time it is, where you are listening from, and what corner of the world is holding you tonight. There is something gentle about knowing that all over the earth, in different hours and different darknesses, people are lying down to the same soft voices, learning the same old things, letting the same day fall away. You are not listening alone, even though it feels that way. You never quite are. Now, you do not need to know any philosophy to be here. You do not need to have read a single one of these old books. You do not need to understand a word of Latin or Greek or Chinese, or to know who any of these long dead men were. I will tell you everything you need as we go, slowly, gently, the way you might explain something to a friend who is half asleep already. There is nothing to figure out. There is nothing to study. There is only this slow unfolding of a single, comforting idea told to you in the dark so that you can let it carry you down into sleep. And the idea is about power. which is a strange word to bring into a quiet room at night, I know. It sounds loud, it sounds like effort. But stay with me, because the kind of power we are going to spend these hours with is the quietest thing there is. Let me begin by naming something you may have felt. Somewhere in your life, in some corner of it, you have probably felt powerless, not in a dramatic way, just quietly. Maybe it is at work, where someone louder than you takes the room and you sit there with the better idea and say nothing. Maybe it is in love, where you find yourself waiting on someone else's mood, watching their face for a sign, never quite sure where you stand. Maybe it is with a friend, an old friend who has changed somehow or grown distant, and you do not know how to reach them anymore, and you feel small and unsure and a little bit invisible. We all have one of these corners, a place where it seems the power is always on the other side of the table, in someone else's hands, and never in ours. And so we lie awake sometimes and turn it over. We replay the conversation. We think of what we should have said. We feel the helplessness of it, the smallness of it. And somewhere underneath, there is an old, aching question that almost never gets asked out loud. The question is simply this: what is power, really, and do I have any of it at all? Tonight, slowly in the dark, we are going to answer that question. And the answer is kinder than you might expect. Because here is the first thing the old thinkers understood, the thing that becomes the spine of everything we will explore tonight. There is not one kind of power, there are two, and we spend most of our lives confusing them. There is power over others, and there is power over yourself. A thinker named Hannah Arendt drew a line very close to this. She spoke of the difference between power over and the power to. The power over others is the power of command, of coercion, of making someone do what you want. But the power to, she said, is something else entirely. It is the power to act, the power to begin something, the power that rises up in a person who has gathered themselves and is ready to move. One kind of power presses down on the world from above. The other kind grows from the inside out. And it is this second kind, the power to, the power over yourself, that we are floating toward tonight. Sit with that distinction for a moment, because it is the whole map. Power over others, power over yourself. One is loud, and it lives outside you, in the eyes and the obedience of other people, which means it can always be taken away. The other is quiet, and it lives inside you in the way you meet your own fear and your own anger and your own restless mind, which means no one can ever reach in and take it from you. Not your boss, not the friend who drifted, not the person whose face you keep watching for approval. No one. Now I want to tell you about a man, because this idea is easier to feel when it has a face. Picture the most powerful man in the entire known world, not a metaphor, an actual man who actually lived, who actually held more power than almost anyone before him. His name was Marcus Aurelius, and he was the emperor of Rome. Try to feel for just a moment what that means. He commanded armies. He ruled over millions of people across an empire so vast it would take months to cross. He could, with a single word, raise a man up or end his life. There was no one above him. There was no one who could tell him no. Whatever a human being could want in the way of power over others, he had it, all of it, completely. And here is the strange, beautiful thing. Here is the thing that once you really see it, changes how you understand power forever. At night, when the day was done, this man, the most powerful man alive, would take out a private journal. Not a book meant to be published, not a speech for the crowds. A small, quiet notebook that he wrote only for himself, that we now call the Meditations. And in it, page after page, he wrote about power. But not the kind you would expect. He did not write about how to control his armies, or how to outmaneuver his rivals, or how to hold his vast empire together. He wrote, almost entirely, about how to govern one single thing: himself. He wrote to remind himself to be patient. He wrote to talk himself out of anger. He wrote about how to meet difficult people without becoming bitter, how to face death without fear, how to rise in the morning when he did not want to, how to keep his own mind calm and clear and good in the middle of everything. The most powerful man in the world spent his private nights wrestling not with other people, but with his own impatience, his own resentment, his own restless heart. Let that land softly. Of all the things he could have written about with all the power in the world already in his hands, the thing he found worth working on night after night was the governing of himself. Why? Why would a man who had complete power over others spend his deepest, most private effort on power over himself? Because he had learned something that the loud world never quite learns. He had learned that all that outer power, the armies and the empire and the obedience of millions, none of it could make him calm. None of it could keep him from lying awake at night the way you might be lying awake now. None of it could govern the one country that actually decided whether his life felt good or terrible, and that country was not Rome. It was the small, quiet kingdom of his own mind. He could command an empire and still be a slave to his own anger. He could rule the world and still not rule himself. And he understood, with all that power as his proof, that the second was the only one that ever really mattered. So think of him tonight as you lie there. The most powerful man in the known world, awake in the dark in his own time, 2,000 years ago, choosing to put down the empire and pick up the only power worth having. The quiet one, the inward one, the one that cannot be taken away. The very same one that is available to you right now with nothing in your hands and no empire to your name, simply because you are a person with a mind, learning to come home to yourself. That is the secret hiding inside the loudest word there is. Power, the real kind, the lasting kind, was never out there in the world at all. It was always here, in the breath, in the stillness, in the way you meet your own night. And you, lying here, asking for nothing, needing nothing, letting the day fall away, are closer to it than the emperor ever was when he held the world. Let us pause here again. Take a slow, deep breath. Notice how the room has grown a little softer, how your body has grown a little heavier, how the idea of two powers has begun to settle somewhere below your thinking. You do not need to hold on to any of it. Just let it rest in you the way warmth rests in a stone after the sun has gone. And when you are ready, with no hurry at all, we will go on together gently toward the old strategist who taught that the greatest victory is the one you never have to fight for. There is a book that has been called the most dangerous ever written, not because it describes weapons or catastrophes, but because it lays out, in plain, quiet sentences, how the world of conflict actually works, stripped of all the softening stories we tell ourselves about it. For 2,500 years, generals and kings and scholars and ordinary people have read it in secret, under lamplight, in translation, wondering how something so brief could contain so much. It is shorter than many of the articles you scroll past without finishing, and at its very center, at the still heart of everything it has to say about strategy and conflict and the uses of force, there is something entirely unexpected. The highest form of winning, it says, is the battle you never have to fight at all. The art of war, Sun Tzu Bungfa in the original. Attributed to Sun Tzu, a military strategist of ancient China, somewhere in the broad and rolling expanse of the Eastern Zhou period, roughly the 5th century before the Common Era. Though scholars are careful here, and the caution itself is interesting, The single author named Sun Tzu may be a composite, a figure shaped over time and layered with legend, the way a river shapes a stone into smoothness over centuries. The text, as we know it, likely arrived at its present form, gradually, carried and refined by many hands. The name points not to one man at one desk on one afternoon, but to a tradition, a lineage of thinking, the accumulated wisdom of people who had watched enough conflict to understand, finally, that the point was never to fight more cleverly. It was to arrange things so that cleverness was never needed. And this is the first thing to understand as you lie here, not fighting anything, not conquering anything, simply resting. The book is about war, but it is not a celebration of war. It is, at its core, a meditation on how to make war unnecessary. Think of that for a moment. The most famous military text in human history is, in its deepest reading, an argument against fighting. The whole strategic architecture bends away from force, away from the direct confrontation, away from the swinging of the sword. It bends instead towards something quieter, positioning, timing, knowledge, and the patient shaping of circumstances so that the conflict dissolves before it begins. The master, Sun Tzu teaches, never has to raise a hand. The master has already won by the time anyone else has decided what to do. To win 100 battles is not the highest skill. To subdue the enemy without fighting, that is the highest skill. Read that slowly, not as a war tactic. Read it as a way of understanding power itself. Real power, the text is saying, does not announce itself with the crash and thunder of 100 battles. It announces itself with silence, with a situation so well understood, so carefully prepared for, that force was never the right instrument. The loudest battles in history have almost always been failures of something: foresight, of patience, of the willingness to know your circumstances before you acted in them. And so the greatest strategist who ever lived, the one whose name has lasted 25 centuries, was teaching not how to fight, but how to make fighting unnecessary. There is something almost gentle about that if you let it in. Let us sit with a parable for a moment. Let us imagine a small valley in that ancient world, 2 villages on either side of a narrow pass, each one watching the other, each one sure that any morning now the other will come over the ridge with weapons drawn. There is a young commander on one side of this pass who has read enough and seen enough and thought enough to understand that the other village is frightened, not aggressive, frightened. That they have been watching the valley for signs of threat and reading ordinary movement. A farmer carrying tools at dawn, a column of smoke from a cold morning's fire, as preparation for attack. He does not march across the pass to demonstrate dominance. He does not fire an arrow to establish deterrence. He sends across instead a single man carrying bread and an invitation to talk. And the other side, which had been awake all night making plans for defense, looks at the bread, looks at the invitation, and something in the room shifts. The whole story they had been telling about the coming battle loses its footing. No battle, no blood. The situation understood, the fear on both sides seen clearly, and that seeing, that knowledge, dissolving what force could only have hardened. That is Sun Tzu's highest skill, made small enough to hold. And it is not a story about ancient China. It is a story about every meeting you have ever avoided, every conversation you have talked yourself out of having, every conflict that grew larger in the dark than it would ever have been in the daylight. The battle most of us are not fighting is the one inside, where we rehearse the confrontations that never happen and sharpen arguments for the problems that resolve themselves while we are busy rehearsing. The real enemy, the text seems to know, is often the image we have of the enemy, the story we carry rather than the truth we might discover if we looked. And so the Sunzi Bangfa is, in a sense, a treatise on attention, on knowledge, on the quality of seeing. Before any question of force or strategy comes this prior question: Do you actually know what you are dealing with? Do you know who is on the other side of the situation? Do you know what they want and what they fear? And the harder question, the one the text insists on with a particular firmness, do you know yourself? Know yourself and know your opponent, Sun Tzu says, and you need not fear the outcome of 100 battles. Know only yourself, and you will win some and lose others. Know neither, and you will be in danger every time. That ranking is worth resting in. Self-knowledge is listed not as a spiritual virtue or a philosophical luxury, but as a strategic necessity. Half of all safety, the text implies, is self-knowledge. The other half is knowledge of the situation outside you. And crucially, knowing yourself comes first. It is the foundation. Without it, the knowledge of your circumstances cannot help you, because you will not be able to act from it clearly. You will act instead from your fears, from your habits, from the stories you have been telling yourself long before you knew the situation required a different story. For a sleep meditation on the nature of power, this is the passage that matters most. Not the clever tactics, not the chapter on deception or terrain. This. Knowing yourself is half of all safety. The person who meets the world without that knowledge, who rushes into circumstances still a stranger to their own motives and fears, is the person most likely to fight battles that did not need to be fought and lose the ones that were avoidable. And you tonight, simply by being willing to lie still with a thought rather than fleeing from it, are practicing something Sun Tzu would have recognized: the turning of attention inward, the willingness to see what is actually there rather than what the noise of the day suggested was there. This is the beginning of the knowledge the old strategist was pointing at. Not dramatic, not martial, just this, quiet, honest attention. The lamp held still enough that the room comes clear. Let us carry that image forward now, because it leads us somewhere even quieter. From the mountains of ancient China, in that same broad stretch of time, there came another voice. Or another name at least, because here again the biography dissolves into legend the closer you approach it. Lao Tzu, Old Master, said to have written the Tao Te Ching, the Book of the Way, and its power sometime in the 6th or 5th century before the Common Era. Perhaps a single author, perhaps, like the Sun Tzu Bungfa, a tradition wearing the name of one man, the collected thinking of many years and many minds brought to stillness and set down in 81 short, strange, crystalline passages. What these two texts share, the strategist and the sage, is the same deep suspicion of force, the same patient argument that the loudest, most direct approach is almost always the weakest, the same turning away from domination towards something far more subtle and far more lasting. The Tao Te Ching offers an image so simple it could be explained to a child, and so deep it has held philosophers across 25 centuries. Water, it says, is the softest thing in the world. And yet, given enough time, water wears away the hardest stone. Not through force, not through impact, not through the dramatic, concentrated blow that cracks rock in a quarry. Through gentleness, through persistence, through the quiet, patient, effortless repetition of simply being what it is and going where it naturally goes. And the old text calls this power. Think of the stone on a riverbed, smooth, rounded, worn by nothing more dramatic than the water passing over it year after year, decade after decade, the water asking nothing of the stone, simply moving in its nature, and in that effortless movement reshaping everything it touches. There is no moment when the water wins, there is no battle, there is no strategy even in the ordinary sense. There is only the quality of water being water and the slow, certain result. This is Wu Wei, a phrase that does not translate easily, the way the most important things never quite do. It is often given as non-action or effortless action, or action in accordance with nature. And none of these is quite right, but together they begin to circle what the original gestured toward. Wu Wei is not passivity, it is not giving up. It is not the limp resignation of someone who has stopped caring, it is the art of acting from your deepest nature, in harmony with the current of the situation, without forcing, without straining, without needing the world to be different from what it is in order to do what needs doing. The image of water is the best illustration. Water does not argue with the riverbed. It does not force itself over the stone in a fit of determination. It simply finds the way it can go, moves there and moves again. And in that persistent, patient, completely effortless following of its own nature, it changes the shape of everything it touches over time, without drama, without a single battle. And the sage, Lao Tzu suggests, leads in the same way, not by forcing people toward an outcome, not by dominating the room or issuing commands that fill the air with the smell of authority. The sage leads by following the shape of things, by understanding what is already trying to happen and helping it happen, by being the still place in the moving water, the quiet center from which others take their direction without ever being told to. The sage is great, the text says, precisely by not contending. This sounds impossible or paradoxical until you have met someone like this in ordinary life. And almost everyone has, the person in the room who says very little but who, when they do speak, somehow changes the whole weather. The friend who never insists on anything but around whom things tend to go right. The colleague who does not push for recognition, but who, quietly, everyone turns to when the moment actually matters. They do not contend, they do not fight for ground. And because of that, because they are not using up their energy in the small daily battles for position and recognition, they have something left, a kind of ease, a quality of presence that people are drawn to without quite knowing why. That is the effortless action that the old text is pointing at, not mystical when you see it in a real person, entirely practical, simply the result of not wasting the self on what does not matter, so that what does matter can be met with clarity and warmth. Wu Wei, in the everyday world, the power of water, the strength of not contending. Let us stay here a little longer. Because this is not a cold philosophy, it is an image that can be held in the body, not just the mind, when you feel the pull to force something, an argument, a relationship, a situation that resists you. There is a kind of spending that happens in that forcing, a tightening, a diminishing of something. You know the feeling, the effort that costs more than it produces, the pushing that makes the resistance harder, the held breath that goes nowhere. And then you have also known the opposite of that. The moments when you stopped pushing and the thing resolved itself. When you moved around the obstacle instead of through it and found, to your quiet astonishment, that the path was shorter. When you said less in a tense conversation and the tension, with nothing to feed on, simply faded. These moments are not failures of will, they are not weakness. They are Wu Wei, happening naturally in the cracks of ordinary life, in those spaces where you were tired enough or wise enough or simply present enough to stop forcing and let the water be water. Sun Tzu's highest skill and Lao Tzu's softest power are the same thing, arriving from different directions, meeting at the same still point. Win without fighting, flow without forcing. Know yourself so well that the battle was unnecessary before it began. And what ties them together? The thread that runs through the Sun Tzu Bungfa and the Tao Te Ching and back to Marcus Aurelius in his tent is this: that power over the self precedes and makes possible everything else, not as preparation for domination, but as the condition for clarity. for the right action in the right moment, for the ease that does not come from having conquered anything outside you, but from having, slowly and quietly, made peace with what is inside. The philosopher who goes by the name Sun Tzu did not teach tactics for the sake of tactics. He was teaching attention, the quality of seeing yourself and your situation honestly, which alone gives you the freedom to respond rather than react, to choose rather than be carried. That self-knowledge, listed as half of all safety, is not a military asset. It is a human one. It belongs to anyone who is willing to sit with it, in any century, in any room, on any quiet night. And Lao Tzu was teaching something one step beyond that. Not just the quality of seeing, but the quality of being. The willingness to stop performing strength and simply be strong, to stop seeking power and move in the direction that power, the quiet kind, the lasting kind, is already moving toward you. The water does not try to wear away the stone. It simply is what it is, and the stone changes. You do not have to try to become anything tonight. You simply are what you are, and already in that, quietly, something is being shaped and worn smooth and made ready, without effort, without force, without a single battle. Let us pause here. Take a slow, deep breath. Feel the weight of your body against whatever is holding it. The softness under you, the dark around you. There is nothing you need to do with any of what you have just heard. No lesson to apply, no strategy to remember. Just the image of water moving over stone, soft and certain and unhurried, going where it naturally goes, changing everything in the kindest possible way, and asking nothing in return. You are not fighting anything tonight. You are not subduing anything. You are simply being still in the way that water is still in a pool after the ripple has passed. Quietly gathering, quietly present. Let the thinking slow. Let it go where it wants to go, gently, without following it. And when you are ready, with no particular hurry, we will continue together into the strangest, most misread, most misrepresented thinker of all, the one who was called a monster and turned out to be, of all unlikely things, a philosopher of the inward life. But we do not need to rush toward him. He will be there in the dark when we arrive. Take another breath. Let the room be soft. Let the water move over the stone. And notice, if you like, before we go on, what has happened in this part of the night. Two ancient texts, both from that long, strange era before the common era when human thinking was doing something remarkable across the whole world at once, in China and Greece and India, all at the same time, the philosophical tradition flowering separately in three places as if the world had been ready for a long time and had simply been waiting for a moment of quiet to speak. Two texts, both concerned with the nature of power and conflict, both arriving at the same conclusion from different routes. The best strategist wins before the battle begins. The water wears away the stone without trying. Self-knowledge is the foundation of everything that comes after. The sage leads by not contending. These are not four separate insights. They are one insight turning slowly in the light so you can see all its sides. That the reaching out for power, the loud grasping, the hard forcing of circumstances toward your preferred outcome, this is the weaker path. Not morally weaker, though perhaps that too, but practically weaker. It spends what it needs to keep. It hardens what it needs to soften. It uses force where attention would have served, and attention would have cost far less and lasted far longer. And the stronger path, quieter, less obvious, more easily mistaken for passivity, is the one that begins with knowing yourself, with governing yourself, with not needing the world to bend in order for you to remain standing, with being, in the old Taoist image, the person who flows where there is a way to flow and rests without shame where there is no way yet. In the morning, There will be meetings and small negotiations, and the ordinary friction of a life lived alongside other people. In the morning, there will be moments when something in you wants to press and insist, and moments when the wiser move is to simply stop. In the morning, Sun Tzu and Lao Tzu will be there in those moments, not as quotations, not as lessons to deploy, but as a kind of texture in your thinking, a gentle resistance to the impulse to force. But that is the morning. This is the night, and the night asks nothing of you but this: to rest in the knowledge that the highest skill was never the dramatic one, that the softest thing can do the most lasting work, that you do not have to fight tonight or perhaps ever the 100 battles you are imagining. You can put them down, let them rest on the riverbed like stones going smooth, and the water moves over them gentle and unhurried and completely at ease, doing what water does, which is simply to be itself without apology, and in that being, over all the long and quiet time there is, changing everything. There is a line from the Tao Te Ching, the old text attributed to Lao Tzu, written down somewhere around the 6th or 5th century BCE, though like Sun Tzu, the figure behind it may be more legend than biography, the kind of author who is also an idea, that goes something like this. The supreme good is like water, which nourishes all things without striving, and settles in places that people disdain, and in this it is close to the Tao. Water does not argue with the shape of the land. It finds the low places, the overlooked hollows, the channels that gravity has made available, and it goes there without resistance, without complaint, and without any apparent ambition. And yet, the Grand Canyon. The word "yet" is doing a great deal of work in that sentence, and it is worth sitting with for a moment before we move on, because the Grand Canyon is a mile deep in places. The Colorado River made it, not in a single dramatic act, not through any one catastrophic event, just water moving over a very long time, wearing at the stone with patience so vast it is nearly impossible to conceive of as intention. And yet there it is, a mile deep, visible from space. Lao Tzu called this Wu Wei, effortless action. Not the absence of action, but the absence of forcing. The difference between a river and a battering ram. One destroys itself against the wall it cannot break. The other finds the way around, or waits, or seeps into the cracks that time has made, and quietly, over the long arc of things, does what could not be done by force in 1,000 years of trying. Let us explore a story about this. There was once a woman who had been arguing with her neighbor for 11 years about a fence, not a large fence, a wooden boundary marker along the back edge of both their properties, slightly crooked, leaning 3 inches over the agreed line. 11 years. She had letters, she had photographs, she had a surveyor's report she had paid for herself, laminated, which she kept in a drawer. She opened sometimes just to remind herself that she was right. And she was right. The fence was wrong. The documents confirmed it. The law was on her side. But 11 years had passed and the fence had not moved. What had moved, slowly, was the quality of every morning. She could not stand in her garden without feeling the fence. She could not look at the birds in the yard without the fence entering the corner of her eye. 11 years of rightness, and the fence still leaned its 3 inches into her life. One afternoon, for no reason she could name, she stopped. She did not stop being right. She stopped pressing. She let the weight of the 11 years put itself down, the way you put down a heavy bag you have been carrying for so long you forgot it was in your hand. She planted a rose bush. It was a small thing. She watered it. She did not move the fence, and she did not speak to the neighbor about it anymore. She simply stopped, sending her force against the wall. And something strange happened. Not immediately, not that afternoon, but slowly, in the way that water works rather than hammers, the situation changed. Without the friction of her sustained pressing, her neighbor seemed to lose whatever it was that had kept him fixed. There was a conversation, unremarkable and unplanned, over the fence one spring morning about something else entirely. Weather or the state of the back alley she couldn't remember. And somehow, by the end of it, he had offered to have the fence looked at. She did not know why she had not asked. She had only stopped not asking. It was not a perfect story. It was not a story about justice arriving on schedule. It was a story about water, about the way that sustained non-forcing can sometimes do what sustained forcing could not. Lao Tzu would have recognized it. He would have said nothing dramatic about it. He would have called it the nature of things. The sage, he wrote, does not contend, and therefore no one can contend with him. This is the quietest formulation of power there is. The person who does not need to win the argument is in some way beyond argument's reach, not because they are weak or indifferent, but because they are not playing the game that the argument requires. You cannot beat someone at a game they have stopped playing. Sun Tzu understood this too. They were not the same thinker. Sun Tzu's world was military and strategic. Lao Tzu's was philosophical and cosmological. But they both arrived from different directions at the same riverbank. The highest skill is not to fight. The highest wisdom is not to contend. The deepest power is the kind that resolves situations without having to become a battering ram. And this connects gently to what Sun Tzu wrote about knowledge. He was very precise about it. Know yourself and know the other, he said, and you will not be endangered in 100 engagements. Know only yourself and not the other, and you will win some and lose some. Know neither, and you will be in danger every time. Notice that self-knowledge is listed first. And notice what it implies. Even in the most practically oriented military text of the ancient world, even in a book literally about how to win wars, the first half of all safety is knowing yourself. Not the terrain. Not the enemy's numbers. Yourself. This is not an accident. It is the same spine we have been following all along this quiet night. The power that holds when everything is uncertain, when the terrain changes, when the adversary is unpredictable, when fortune does what fortune does and floods the plans you made. The power that remains standing in all of that is the one that was never about external conditions in the first place. Machiavelli saw it through the lens of fortune and virtue. You can prepare, build your channels, shore up your banks, and when the flood comes, you will have something to meet it with. But you cannot stop the flood. Half is yours, half is not. Sun Tzu sees the same thing from the military ridge. The part of victory that belongs to you, that you can earn and protect and rely on, begins with knowing what is actually in you. Your capacities, your fears, your tendencies under pressure, the part that is self-knowledge, the rest, the other, the terrain, the circumstances, it shifts. But you carry yourself into every engagement. Better to know what that is. There is a teaching in the art of war, and these are not the flashy tactical lines that appear on motivational posters, that says the victorious warrior wins first and then goes to war, while the defeated warrior goes to war first and then seeks to win. It sounds like a riddle, but what it means is simply this: preparation is interior. The victory is prepared in the quality of your self-knowledge, your training, your honesty about your own limits. Then you enter the situation. You do not enter and hope to find the victory once you are inside it. This is not a frightening idea. Sitting with it quietly, here in the late dark, it is actually a calming one, because it means that the most important work happens in the quiet time, in the time before, in the hours like this one, when nothing is demanded of you and you can simply be with yourself honestly and without performance. Take a slow, deep breath. Notice the weight of the blanket, the particular stillness of the room you are in, the sound, if there is one, of the world outside at rest. You are doing the thing that Sun Tzu named as the foundation. You are with yourself, not distracted, not pressing against any wall. Just here, present, honest about your own smallness and also your own sufficiency. And Lao Tzu would say, "Good. This is the closest you have been to the Tao all day. When you are ready, we will continue together." There is a man sitting at a small desk in the Tuscan countryside sometime in the year 1513. Outside, the hills look exactly as they always have: cypress trees, dusty roads, the low sound of farm animals in the early morning. Inside, the man is writing. He is not writing from power. He is writing from the other side of it, from the place where power was and is no longer. And this is the thing that almost nobody mentions when they speak of Niccolò Machiavelli. Most people who have heard his name carry a picture with them: the cold schemer, the man who said the ends justify the means, the original villain of political thought, teaching princes how to lie, manipulate, and crush. The adjective that came from his name, Machiavellian, means something almost entirely sinister now, a kind of calculated, ruthless cunning. People say it to describe someone who cannot be trusted. But sit with the biography for a moment, because it changes everything. Machiavelli had served the Republic of Florence for 14 years. He was not an aristocrat or a prince. He was a senior diplomat, a civil servant, a man who believed in republican government and devoted more than a decade of his life to it. He traveled on diplomatic missions. He studied how states worked, how armies were organized, how leaders actually behaved, not in theory, but in practice, in the rooms where decisions were made. He watched carefully. He was good at his work. Then the Medici family returned to power in Florence in 1512, and Machiavelli's position dissolved overnight. He was not merely dismissed, he was suspected of conspiracy. He was arrested, he was imprisoned, he was tortured, a specific and terrible method called strappado, in which a person's hands are bound behind their back and they are hoisted into the air by a rope attached to the wrists, then dropped, their weight caught at the last moment by the rope. It was designed to produce pain and eventually confession. Machiavelli survived it without confessing because there was nothing to confess. He was eventually released under a general amnesty. He went to his small property outside Florence, the one he could still afford, and he found himself exiled from public life entirely. The Prince was written in that exile. This is the first thing to hold in the quiet of this hour. The most famous book about power was not written by a man who held power. It was written by a man sitting in the wreckage of having lost it, by a man who had been tortured and discarded, watching from the outside as the city he had served simply moved on without him. The Prince was, in part, an application, a long, careful letter to the Medici, his former captors and new rulers, arguing implicitly, "Look at what I understand about how power actually works. Give me a role, I have something to offer." He was never called back. There is something deeply human in this image, a man who understood the mechanisms of something perfectly, who had studied it his whole career, suddenly on the outside of it, writing his best thinking into a book that the people he addressed barely read. Sit with that for a moment. Not with the cynicism of it, but with the ache. He was not a monster sitting on a throne. He was a careful observer who had lost everything and was trying, through the only instrument he had left in his mind, his pen, his years of watching, to say, "Here is what I saw, here is how it actually works." That changes the book considerably. He was not prescribing, he was describing, with the precision of a man who no longer had to perform loyalty to anyone because he had nothing left to protect. That is a particular kind of freedom, and it produces a particular kind of honesty. So when he asks, and he does ask it plainly in a way that has made readers wince for 500 years, whether it is better for a prince to be loved or to be feared, we should hear the question the way a diagnostician asks it, not the way a cynic celebrates it. He was not rubbing his hands together. He was looking at the world as it is, stripping away the comfortable story of how it ought to be, and trying to answer honestly. And his answer, read carefully, is not what the caricature says. He writes that it would be best to be both loved and feared. He is not choosing fear. He is noting that both together is the ideal. But he then acknowledges what he had seen again and again in his years of diplomatic observation, that the two rarely coincide, that when they are forced into tension, love tends to be unstable because it depends on the judgment and goodwill of others, and people, when pressed, will choose their own interest over their love. Whereas fear, a specific kind of fear, a sober sense of consequence, tends to hold more reliably because it comes from your own hands, from what you actually do. And this is the part that gets quietly dropped when people quote him, he immediately says something essential. The prince must above all avoid being hated. He must avoid being hated. Fear without hatred is manageable. Fear with hatred is a powder keg. He goes into considerable detail about this. Do not touch a person's property. Do not touch a person's family. Do not humiliate people publicly. Do not be capricious or arbitrary. These are the things that breed hatred. A ruler who inspires sober respect, even uncomfortable respect, and who is predictable and fair in their dealings can hold power. A ruler who inspires contempt and hatred cannot hold it for long, no matter how many instruments of coercion they possess. Fear without hatred, respect without resentment. Scale this down gently from the palace to the ordinary room. The person at work who makes every decision feel like a threat, who keeps everyone slightly unstable, who takes credit and assigns blame, this person may hold authority for a while. But they are building something that requires constant maintenance, constant pressure, constant vigilance. The moment the pressure lifts, the system sags. People comply because they have to. They do not contribute beyond what is required. They leave the moment a better option appears. Now think of the other kind, the person whose competence you trust so thoroughly that their judgment carries weight in a room even before they speak. Not because they have intimidated you into it, but because over time they have shown you something real. They said what they would do and they did it. They did not take things from you that were not theirs to take. They acknowledged your effort. They were hard on problems rather than on people. This person holds a kind of power that doesn't need enforcement. It is self-sustaining. It regenerates. Machiavelli was describing the first kind because he was writing for princes who had real armies and real dungeons. But the principle underneath, that power built on resentment and hatred is expensive, fragile, and ultimately self-defeating, while power built on respect has a different quality of durability, this principle moves across contexts. It scales down to an office, to a family, to a friendship. He was not celebrating cruelty. He was noting, with the clinical precision of a man who had watched governments collapse, that cruelty used carelessly is power undoing itself. He made another distinction that is worth sitting with. He wrote about cruelty well used and cruelty badly used. These are uncomfortable words to say aloud, and they need a gentle translation. What he meant, read at the level of the structure rather than the surface, was this: a decisive, contained action taken once, cleanly, in a moment of necessity, something like a difficult decision that has to be made, a hard conversation that cannot be postponed any longer, is not the same thing as ongoing escalating punishment and harm. The first ends the problem. The second becomes the problem. In the ordinary texture of your life, this resolves into something quite mild. There are conflicts that should have been addressed directly and weren't, and so they grew. There are conversations that should have happened in the first week, and instead waited a month, 3 months, a year. And by then, the original thing was buried under layers of accumulated feeling, and the conversation had become much harder than it would have been. There are situations where a clear, single, honest statement, not dramatic, not punishing, just truthful, would have closed something that was allowed instead to fester and spread. Machiavelli, from his years of watching power work and misfire, was saying, the longer a wound goes unaddressed, the worse it gets. The decisive moment, handled cleanly, is an act of genuine care toward the future. The avoidance of it looks like kindness and is not. This is not a call to confrontation. In the sleep-soft quiet of this hour, let it be something else entirely. A reminder that things left untended do not resolve themselves, that the soft action taken now is almost always gentler than the much harder action required later. The other great concept Machiavelli brings into the room is one that sounds almost astrological at first, but is actually a beautiful and calming idea. He writes about virtù and fortuna. Virtù, in his usage, does not mean virtue in the moral sense. It has nothing to do with being good or following rules. It comes from the Latin vir man, in the old Roman sense of vigor and capability. Virtù is the quality of being capable, skilled, energetic, responsive to the world as it actually is, rather than as you wish it to be. It is practical excellence, the ability to read a situation clearly and act well within it. Fortuna is fortune, chance, the unpredictable flow of circumstances, the things that happen to you that you did not choose and cannot entirely control. The political winds, the economy, the illness that arrives without warning, the opportunity that appears at an angle you were not expecting. All of the vast external movement that constitutes the world. And Machiavelli's accounting between them is generous and honest. He estimated that roughly half of what happens to us is fortuna, beyond our reach, beyond our planning, beyond our control. The other half, he said, is left to us. He describes fortuna as a river that floods. You cannot stop the flood. When the river rises, it rises and the landscape is remade. But in the calm season, in the times between floods, you can build channels, you can shore up banks, you can redirect the water's flow into something manageable, not mastered, managed, not conquered, channeled. Half is fortune and half is ours. Sit with the proportion for a moment, not the anxious reading of it. Oh no, half of everything is outside my hands. The other reading, the calming one, half is yours. Half of this enormous life, of its shape and direction and quality, belongs to what you do with your virtù, your capability, your willingness to work on yourself, and your skills and your readiness. Machiavelli was not writing a fatalistic philosophy. He was writing one that takes luck seriously without surrendering to it. He had been unlucky himself, badly, historically unlucky. The Medici returned. The Republic fell. He was arrested through no real fault of his own. The river flooded and took everything, and yet he sat down and wrote. He used his virtù in the only space still available to him. He prepared in the only way he could. And the book he wrote in that exile has been read for 500 years. Fortune shapes the circumstances. Virtù shapes you. Now there is a modern echo of something Machiavelli understood. This sense that perception is not mere vanity, that how you are seen is not a surface thing but a real causal force in how events actually unfold. And it was confirmed in a different language, in a different century. In 1920, a psychologist named Edward Thorndike documented something he called the halo effect. He was studying military officers and their evaluations of one another, and he noticed something strange. When an officer was rated positively on one quality, say physical bearing or general intelligence, they tended to be rated positively on everything else too, even qualities that had no logical connection to the first. And when they were rated negatively on one thing, the negative assessment bled outward. One impression organized all the others. The halo of a first quality, positive or negative, hung over everything that followed. This is not a finding about vanity or superficiality. It is a finding about how human perception actually works. We are not able to assess each quality of a person independently, with fresh eyes, stripped of everything else we know about them. We are not built that way. We carry impressions. We carry feelings from one encounter into the next. A single, strong impression of warmth, of competence, of generosity, of carelessness sets a kind of tone that the mind then tries to confirm. Machiavelli understood this without the laboratory. He saw it in the courts and councils where reputation was a real force, where a prince who was seen as decisive was assumed to be decisive even in situations that hadn't been tested yet, where a prince seen as weak was assumed to be weak even when the specific situation didn't warrant that judgment. Perception casts a long shadow. Managing it is not vanity. It is understanding that you live inside other people's impressions of you, and those impressions have consequences. Robert Merton gave the mechanism its modern name in 1948, the self-fulfilling prophecy. A belief about a situation, even a false belief, can produce behavior that makes the belief come true. If people believe you are capable, they bring you more difficult problems, give you more responsibility, trust your judgment more readily, and in response to all of that expanded opportunity, you often do become more capable. If people believe you are incompetent, they shelter you from challenge, second-guess your decisions, give you less, and without the exercise, the capability may genuinely erode. The belief created the condition that confirmed the belief. This is what Machiavelli was pointing at without those particular words. He was saying, the story people tell about you is not separate from your actual power. It is a component of it. Reputation is not a luxury that comes after real competence is established. It runs alongside competence, interacts with it, shapes the opportunities that test and develop it further. And the way it tips, the way a single quality bleeds into the assessment of everything else, was identified still more precisely by the psychologist Susan Fiske and her colleagues, who spent decades studying the deepest grammar of how we judge each other. They found that underneath all the complexity of social judgment, two dimensions account for most of it. Warmth. Whether a person seems kind, friendly, trustworthy in an interpersonal way, and competence, whether a person seems capable, skilled, effective. These two axes organize almost everything. We assess every person we meet along both of them, almost instantly, often before they have spoken more than a sentence. And here is the part that quietly confirms everything the philosophers were gesturing toward. Loud dominance, the raised voice, the aggressive assertion of status, the visible performance of authority, reads, in most social contexts, as high competence paired with low warmth. People may comply, they may defer, but they do not trust easily, and they do not offer loyalty freely, and they watch for the exit. Whereas the person who holds quiet power in a group, the one whose opinion is sought, whose absence is noticed, who seems to anchor the room, tends to read as both warm and competent at once, not performing either one, just embodying them over time, consistently enough that the halo has been earned rather than manufactured. This is what the dossier of human experience points to, from Machiavelli's careful observation to Thorndike's notebooks to Fiske's research. Quiet power is not the absence of strength. It is strength that has internalized itself, that no longer needs to perform. Take a slow, deep breath here. The room is the same room it was a few minutes ago. Outside, if there is anything outside to hear, it continues at its own pace. You are not required to hold any of this tightly. You can let it settle the way a stone settles in still water, drifting down gradually, coming to rest at the bottom where it belongs. Machiavelli, the man who wrote the most famous book about power, did it from the most powerless position he had ever occupied. Tortured, exiled, writing letters no one answered, studying the river from the bank rather than from the throne. And in that position, stripped of everything external, he found what he actually knew. He found his virtue. The flood had come. He built channels with what was left to him. There is something quietly encouraging about this here, in the late dark. You don't need to be at the height of your power to understand something true about it. Sometimes the most honest view comes from exactly where you are. A little outside the thing you're examining, a little removed from the performance of it, with time to simply look and think. Let us pause here. Take a slow, deep breath. Feel the length of your body wherever you are lying. Feel the particular texture of the night, its temperature, its darkness, its quiet consent to let you rest inside it. There is nothing to figure out right now. The ideas are settling. You are settling. When you are ready, we will continue. Now we come to a philosopher whose name is so loaded with misunderstanding that the misunderstanding itself has become a kind of historical fact. Friedrich Nietzsche, the man whose phrase, will to power, Wille zur Macht, has been used to justify things he never said, attached to movements he never endorsed, shaped into a doctrine he never systematically wrote. But before we go to the ideas, a word about what actually happened to them. Nietzsche collapsed in January 1889 on a street in Turin, a breakdown from which he never recovered, spending the remaining 11 years of his life in mental incapacity. He was cared for by his mother, and then, after her death, by his sister Elizabeth. Elizabeth Förster Nietzsche was a woman with her own political convictions, convictions that Nietzsche himself had found repugnant in his own lifetime, had written against, had actively distanced himself from. She controlled the archive, she controlled the manuscripts, and she assembled from his unpublished notebooks a book she titled The Will to Power, presenting it as his final masterwork, his system. It was not. Scholars who have spent careers with the notebooks are largely agreed on this. The Will to Power, as she published it, is not a book Nietzsche composed. It is a selection made by someone else from fragments and drafts, arranged in ways that served her purposes rather than his. She distorted the archive. The book that carries the most notorious title in all of Nietzsche, the one that sounds most like a doctrine of domination, is the least reliable document for understanding what he actually thought. This matters enormously for understanding what the will to power actually was. What Nietzsche meant by it, gathered from the books he did publish, the works he did complete and authorize, was not at its core about dominating other people. It was not the drive to place your boot on another person's neck. It was something far more interior, far more demanding, far more honest. It was the drive toward growth, the drive toward becoming more than you currently are, the refusal to stagnate, the refusal to become merely comfortable, the restless push toward greater capability and self-understanding. And at its highest expression, it was something he called self-overcoming, Selbstüberwindung, the mastering of yourself. The figure Nietzsche admired was not the brute who crushes others. That, to him, was a relatively easy and frankly lazy form of power. Anyone with enough force and recklessness can dominate. It takes nothing subtle. It proves nothing about the quality of the person. The figure Nietzsche genuinely admired, and he made this clear in his published work, was the person who overcomes themselves, who faces their own weaknesses directly, without the easy escape of blaming someone else for them, who disciplines their impulses not through repression but through redirection, through channeling rather than denying, who becomes, over time, stronger at the level of character. He understood that we are not single, coherent selves. We are something more like a parliament of impulses, competing drives, contradictory desires. We want to rest and we want to grow. We want to be known and we want to hide. We are afraid and we also long to be brave. The ordinary human life involves all of these at once, and the question is not which of them wins in any given moment. It is which of them we are learning to work with, to understand, to place in service of something that actually matters to us. Self-overcoming is not self-punishment. It is not the grim mortification of everything pleasurable or soft in you. Nietzsche had no use for that. He found a particular kind of pleasure in ideas, in music, in landscape, in what he called the joyful science. Self-overcoming was about the honest encounter with the thing in yourself that is smaller than you want to be, and the willingness to stay in that encounter rather than turn away. The thing in yourself that is small, the grudge, the fear, the habit of shrinking, the impulse to blame, you do not have to defeat it in a single moment. You just have to keep looking at it clearly. And there is a connected idea in Nietzsche that belongs here, late at night, when the mind is quiet enough to hear it without flinching. He called it ressentiment. He kept the French word because the German didn't capture the particular quality he meant. Ressentiment is a particular species of weakness. It is the state of the person who feels unable to act, who feels outpaced or outpowered by the world, and who turns that feeling inward and outward simultaneously into a sustained, low-burning resentment, into a grudge that becomes a worldview, into a value system that says the strong are wrong, the capable are corrupt, the powerful are guilty, not because I have evaluated these things clearly, but because my powerlessness needs a story, and this is the most comfortable one. Nietzsche was not saying that every critique of power is ressentiment. He was far more careful than that. He was identifying a specific psychological mechanism, the way that impotence, when it cannot be addressed directly, begins to reframe itself as a form of moral superiority. And he noted that this mechanism, however understandable, is corrosive, not to the people it targets, to the person who carries it. Because resentment requires an enemy, it requires the other person to remain in a specific shape, wrong, lesser, guilty, so that the resentment continues to make sense. The person carrying the grudge is bound to the person they resent more tightly, in a way, than love would bind them. Love can shift and change. Resentment is rigid. It needs the other to stay exactly as they were in the moment the wound was made. And so the person carrying it is, in a quiet sense, still living in that moment. Still in the room where the thing happened. Still arranged around the event that hurt them rather than moving through and past it. This is what Nietzsche was pointing at when he gestured imprecisely and sometimes frustratingly toward the cure. The antidote to ressentiment is not the winning of some argument or the satisfaction of some revenge. It is a self-respect deep enough that it no longer requires an enemy to define itself against. A strength that doesn't need to look down at anyone to feel tall. A quality of being that is simply what it is without needing the other person to be wrong for it to stand. And here, quietly, in the late hours, this is not a demand, it is not a judgment. If you are carrying something tonight, some resentment that has lived in you for months or years, some grudge that you have grown so accustomed to that you barely notice it anymore, you do not have to set it down right now. You cannot simply decide to let go of a thing and have the letting go complete itself. That is not how these things work. But you can notice it. You can notice that it is costing something, that some portion of your energy every day is going toward maintaining a story about what someone else did and who they are and why they are wrong. And you can wonder gently what that portion of your energy might feel like if it were freed, not toward anything in particular, just freed, available. Nietzsche called the highest form of strength a strength quiet enough that it doesn't require anyone else to be lowered. Rest inside that idea for a moment. You can return to it when you are ready. The Stoics built from similar material and arrived at a similar place through a different road, and they are worth a brief visit here in the quiet. Epictetus, who had been a slave, who knew the absence of external power with an immediacy that few philosophers have equaled, arrived at the dichotomy of control. Some things are up to us, some things are not. What is up to us? Our judgments, our desires, our choices, the orientation of our attention, the quality of our effort. What is not up to us? Our bodies, our reputations in others' eyes, our positions, our possessions, the behavior of other people, the movement of events we did not initiate. He was not saying that the things not up to us don't matter. He was saying that the suffering comes from treating them as if they were ours to control. The confusion between what is in our power and what is not. This is, for Epictetus, almost the whole of human unhappiness. Not the circumstances themselves, the misidentification of what belongs to us. And Seneca, writing from the opposite position, from wealth and proximity to the Emperor Nero, from the inside of court life rather than slavery, arrived at the same place. In his letters, over and over, the question he returns to is, what actually belongs to you? Not the fortune which can be taken, not the position which can be revoked, not the health which can change without warning, only the quality of your inner life. Only that. Then there is Marcus Aurelius, whom we met at the beginning of this night, but who belongs here too, in this passage about the Stoics, in this place in the narrative where we are drawing the threads together. He was the Roman emperor. He held power over what was then the largest organized political entity on earth. Armies, territory, law, taxation, the fates of provinces. More external power than almost any human being in history has held in a single pair of hands. And his private writing, the Meditations, never meant for anyone to read, a journal for himself, is almost entirely about one subject, not strategy, not administration, not the wielding of those immense external resources, about governing himself, about the quality of his own judgments, about not being irritated by petty people, about not seeking praise, about remembering that he would die and the empire would change, and none of the external arrangement was permanent, and so the only durable investment was in the quality of his own character. The man with the most power chose, when the day was done and the lamp was lit and he could write whatever he actually wanted to think about, he chose to think about self-governance, about the interior, about what was truly in his hands. This is the unexpected connection that the philosophers of power, followed honestly, arrive at together. Not from the same direction, not in the same language, but at the same place. Machiavelli's virtue, your capability, your preparation, the interior readiness you bring to fortune, is the same river as Epictetus's what is up to us, is the same river as Nietzsche's self-overcoming, is the same river as Sun Tzu's preparation that constitutes the victory before the battle begins. They are not the same philosophy, but they all notice with different instruments the same fact. The power you cultivate inward is the only power that travels with you. Everything else is borrowed. There is a final modern thread to draw in before this part of the night draws toward its close, and it is both the most counterintuitive and the most quietly reassuring thing in the whole collection. Daché Keltner, a psychologist who has spent much of his career studying power, how it is acquired, how it changes people, what it does to the way a person behaves and perceives the world, found something that the old philosophers might have recognized immediately, but that still surprises people when they hear it stated plainly. He found that people most often rise to power through warmth, through generosity, through attentiveness to others, through the kind of social intuition that makes people feel genuinely seen. These are the qualities that earn trust, that build the coalitions and networks on which real influence rests. The person who gains informal authority in a group, the one whose judgment carries weight before they've formally been given any, usually got there by making others feel valued rather than diminished. And then he found something else, something darker and stranger. Power, once gained, tends to erode the very qualities that earned it. People with power become less attuned to others, less able to read emotional cues accurately, less likely to take perspectives other than their own. They interrupt more, they listen less. The flood of external power slowly washes away the warmth and attentiveness that built the channel in the first place. This is the paradox. The instrument of acquiring power undermines itself upon success. Think about what this means quietly from the inside of a life. The loud pursuit of power, of the performance of dominance, the taking of credit, the claiming of status at others' expense, is not merely unpleasant in the meantime. It is strategically backwards. It destroys the thing that actually accumulates influence. And the reverse is also true. The patient, warm, competent, consistent presence, the person who keeps developing their own capabilities while remaining genuinely interested in the people around them, is not just nicer to be near. They are building something that the loud power seeker is inadvertently destroying. And Robert Cialdini, who spent decades studying social influence, not manipulation, but the genuine mechanisms by which people actually change their minds and behavior in response to others, found that the most durable influence comes from things like consistency, from reciprocity, from the credibility that comes from being genuinely reliable over time, not from pressure, not from volume, not from the performance of status. The influence that sticks, that persists past the moment of immediate encounter, comes from something quieter, from having actually shown up as what you said you were over and over, until the pattern is undeniable. There is a specific, small, picturable moment that belongs here. The composed person in a tense room. You may have experienced this. A situation becomes heated. Voices tighten, the air in the room changes, people begin to react to each other's reactions in a kind of escalating spiral, and then one person simply doesn't escalate. They don't freeze, they don't disappear. They stay present, their voice at its normal pitch, their manner unchanged by the temperature of the room. And almost always, watch for this, when it happens, because it is remarkable, the room begins to adjust toward them rather than away. The calm becomes the gravity. The stillness draws the volatility toward it, and the volatility begins, almost despite itself, to quiet. This is not a manipulation. The composed person is not doing it strategically in the moment. They are simply not being moved by what everyone else is being moved by, and the contrast of that steadiness reads, in the body and the nervous system of everyone present, as something worth trusting. The Stoics would say they have practiced not confusing what is up to them with what is not. And so when the room escalates, they are not caught in it, because they have quietly, over time, built something that doesn't live in the room's temperature. You can let all of this settle now. And now we arrive at the last of the great thinkers in tonight's company. The one most maligned, most caricatured, most co-opted by people whose purposes he would have found baffling or even contemptible. Friedrich Nietzsche. The name alone does something to a room. It conjures a certain kind of intensity. The moustache, the madness at the end, the fragments of fire in the writing. And somewhere in that atmosphere of intensity, the actual ideas got replaced with a myth of cold dominance, of ruthlessness elevated to philosophy, of a man who looked out at the world and said, "Let the strong take what they can, and let the weak suffer what they must." He didn't say that. Not once. What he did say was stranger and quieter and far more useful to someone lying in the dark, trying to understand what it means to live with dignity and strength. Let us begin with the phrase itself, will to power. In German, der Wille zur Macht. It has a heavy sound to it, a sound that lends itself to misuse. And it was misused, profoundly, historically, in ways that did real damage, and that Nietzsche himself, had he been alive to see them, would have fought against with everything he had. Here is the part that matters, the part the caricature always omits. The book called The Will to Power was not written by Friedrich Nietzsche, not in any real sense of the word. It was assembled after his death, after his mental collapse in 1889, from notebooks and private fragments by his sister Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche. And Elisabeth had interests and affiliations that Nietzsche had spent years of his life publicly opposing. Scholars who have spent their careers on the actual texts, on the books he did finish, did title, did send to press, are largely in agreement that the posthumous collection distorts what the concept meant to him, selecting and arranging the fragments in ways that pulled the ideas toward a politics he explicitly rejected. So before we even ask what will to power means, it helps to know that the version most people encountered was already a kind of misreading, already a thing shaped by another person's purposes. When you go to what Nietzsche actually completed, actually signed his name to, a different picture assembles itself. And at the center of it is a word not often associated with him in popular memory, self-overcoming. Selbstüberwindung in German, though the sound of it matters less than the meaning. Self-overcoming. The idea that the highest and most demanding form of power is not the power you exercise over other people, but the power you exercise over yourself, over your own fears and your own impulses, over the resentments that make you small, over the habits and reactions and untested assumptions that keep you circling the same territory without ever moving through it. His ideal figure, the one he gestures toward in book after book, never quite completing the portrait because he seemed to feel that completing it would be dishonest, that this ideal is always becoming and never arrived, his ideal figure overcomes himself, repeatedly, not once as a victory and then rest, but as a practice that never ends because there is always another layer, always another place where the unexamined reflex is running the show. This is, when you sit with it quietly, one of the most demanding and most generous ideas in all of philosophy. Demanding because it offers no enemy to blame. It keeps pointing back at you, not in cruelty, in honesty. The difficulty in your life, the stuck places, the places where you keep getting the same result you don't want. What if the answer is there, in you, in something you haven't yet had the courage or the clarity to look at directly?
Generous because it also means the work is entirely yours to do. You don't need anyone's permission. You don't need a favorable circumstance. You don't need the world to change first, or the people around you to change first. The territory is your own interior, and you can begin tonight, this moment, by simply acknowledging that there is territory there, unexplored, worth turning toward.
Take a slow breath here. You don't have to do anything with this right now. Just let it be present. The way a door you haven't opened yet can be present in a room. Nietzsche had a concept for the failure mode of self-overcoming, the thing that happens when people don't do the inward work, when they can't or won't turn toward their own difficulty and so the difficulty has to go somewhere else. He called it ressentiment. He kept the French word deliberately, and there's a texture to it that the German or English equivalent doesn't quite carry. Resentment, yes, but something more chronic and more architectural than ordinary resentment. Ressentiment is what grows in the space where action should have been but wasn't. It is the feeling of the powerless who have been unable to respond to what hurt them, and so instead of responding outwardly, they turn the hurt inward and outward simultaneously into a sustained, low-burning hostility that slowly becomes the lens through which they see everything. It is, in Nietzsche's observation, a kind of weakness that has dressed itself up as morality, a value system built from the ground up, not from genuine care or genuine strength, but from the need to find a framework in which the thing that defeated you was wrong, in which your suffering is proof of your virtue, in which those who seem stronger or freer are condemned rather than understood. He was not unsympathetic to the suffering that produces it. He was a deeply sick man for much of his life, often in pain, often isolated, often poorly understood, and he knew what it was to feel the particular ache of being on the outside of something. The compassion in his diagnosis comes precisely from that knowledge. But he was also honest enough to say, staying in ressentiment keeps you small. It gives you an explanation, but not a life. It provides the cold comfort of a continuous grievance, but takes from you the energy that could be turned toward actually becoming more fully yourself. The cure he gestures toward, and it is a gesture, not a prescription, because he distrusted prescriptions, is self-respect that has no need of an enemy. Let that phrase breathe for a moment. Self-respect that has no need of an enemy. Not the self-respect that comes from being better than someone else, not the confidence that depends on another person being diminished, but a kind of quiet inner standing that simply doesn't require anyone to be lowered in order for you to feel yourself standing. This is, I think, one of the more quietly radical ideas available to a person lying in the dark, carrying something they've been carrying too long. A grievance, maybe, an old wrong that still feels warm, even years later. The kind of resentment that visits you at 3 a.m. and recites its own case like a lawyer who will never stop working. Nietzsche would not tell you the grievance isn't real. He would not tell you the wrong wasn't wrong. He would simply observe that the energy you are spending keeping the case open is energy you could be spending becoming more fully the person you actually want to be. And that the strength required to set it down, not to forgive in some performative, self-congratulatory way, but to genuinely stop needing the grievance to define you, that strength is not weakness. It is the hardest and most genuine kind of self-overcoming available in ordinary life. Letting go of a grudge, really letting it go, is an act of power. Not because it helps the other person, it may not, but because it gives you back the territory that the grudge was occupying, and territory is everything. Let yourself breathe again, slowly. The Stoics said this in their own way, and it is worth spending a moment with them here, because they form a quiet bridge between Nietzsche and the practical texture of your ordinary days. Epictetus was born a slave. The biographical fact is almost too on point to be believed, but there it is. The man who became one of the most important teachers of self-governance in human history began his life owning nothing, not even himself. And from that position, from within constraints so total that most of us cannot fully imagine them, he arrived at an idea so clean it has survived 2,000 years without being substantially improved upon. Some things are up to us, some things are not. That is the whole of it. The dichotomy of control, as it has come to be called. What is up to us, our judgments, our desires, our choices, our responses? What is not up to us, everything else, the weather, other people's choices, what happens to us? Reputation in the hands of others, the body's behavior over time, all of it out of our hands. The people who suffer most, Epictetus observed, are those who treat what is not up to them as though it were, and treat what is up to them as though it were not. They exhaust themselves trying to control the uncontrollable and hand their genuine power, the power over their own inner response to circumstance, to other people, to anything that happens to arrive. And the cure is simply, not easily, but simply, to practice the distinction. Every time you notice yourself straining towards something outside your control, you can ask, is this up to me? And if it is not, you can let it be what it is, a fact of the world, not a claim on your inner state. Seneca, who was Nero's tutor and later his victim, a man who lived so close to naked power that its grotesque potential was never abstract to him, Seneca said something in his letters that belongs in this company. He wrote that the greatest empire a man can have is an empire over himself. He used the word empire deliberately, knowing full well what a Roman meant by it, knowing the scale and the weight and the glory the word carried, and then he applied it to the quiet governance of one's own interior, as though that were where the real territory was, as though the external empire, vast as it was almost beside the point. And then, of course, there is the one we began with tonight, Marcus Aurelius. He keeps returning, doesn't he? Like water finding its level. Marcus Aurelius was emperor of Rome. His was the largest empire of the age. He commanded armies and administered the lives of millions of people across an almost incomprehensible geography. He had, by any reasonable measure, more external power than any person in the known world, and he spent his private hours. The meditations were never meant for publication. They were his personal notes, written to himself, instructions and reminders, and the ongoing record of a man trying to keep faith with an idea. He spent those private hours almost entirely on the question of how to govern himself, not others, himself. How to respond with patience when patience was hard, how to remember the irrelevance of insult, how to hold the authority of his role without letting it corrupt the humility he considered necessary for wisdom, how to face difficulty without flinching and comfort without softening, how to keep the capacity for attention, for genuine presence with other people, alive in conditions that could easily have made him remote and armored and finally hollow. He succeeded by most accounts, imperfectly and honestly and persistently. And the record of his attempt, jotted in camp tents and palace rooms, unpolished, sometimes self-repeating, sometimes almost scolding in their directness, that record is still here, still being read in the small hours by people who are not emperors and never will be, who find in it the same questions they are carrying and the same commitment to keep working on them. The most powerful man in the world, spending his nights asking, how can I be less reactive? How can I hold this responsibility without losing myself? How can I do what is genuinely good rather than what merely looks good? There is something almost vertiginous about that if you let yourself feel it. All that external power and the interior project is identical to yours. The scale is different. The questions are the same. Breathe with this for a moment. You don't need to do anything with it. Just let it be beside you, this recognition that the inward work is the work, regardless of where you stand in any external hierarchy. Now, let us turn gently towards something that surprised researchers when they first found it, something that Daché Keltner and his colleagues documented in the study of power and social behavior, a finding so counterintuitive that it functions almost like a small parable. We tend to assume that power is a destination, that you work toward it, you arrive, and then you have it, stably, reliably, as a possession. But the research kept revealing something else, something that Keltner called the paradox of power. Here is how it goes. People tend to rise toward power, toward influence, toward being trusted and followed, through qualities that are relational and warm. empathy, generosity, the capacity to actually listen to other people and take their concerns seriously. The willingness to act for the group rather than only for yourself. These are the qualities, again and again, that cause other people to extend trust, to follow, to grant authority. And then something happens. Power itself tends to erode those very qualities. The person who gained influence through genuine attunement to others begins, gradually, to lose that attunement. Power makes people, on average, less sensitive to other people's emotional states, less interested in perspectives that differ from their own, more focused on the goal and less on the people around them. It narrows the attention. The very tool that built the authority begins, quietly, to rust. This is not inevitable, it is not destiny. Keltner and others found that people who are reminded of their responsibilities to others, rather than just their rights and privileges, tend to hold their power more gracefully. Marcus Aurelius spent every night reminding himself. That was perhaps the function of the meditations, not a spiritual exercise in any mystical sense, but a practical technology for preventing the corrosion that power tends to cause. But the paradox is worth sitting with because it suggests something about the loud, aggressive pursuit of power, the person who makes gaining influence their primary project, who treats every interaction as an opportunity to establish dominance, who mistakes the performance of strength for actual strength. That pursuit tends to produce the very conditions that erode what it's seeking. The grasping makes the thing slip away, not always, not cleanly, but often enough that the pattern is real. And quiet influence built on consistency and warmth and genuine competence, built slowly and without performance, tends to be more durable, not more flashy, not more immediately legible, but more real in the end and more lasting. Robert Cialdini, who spent decades studying the mechanics of social influence, documented something similar. The most durable influence doesn't come from pressure. It doesn't come from the loud insistence or the repeated demand. It comes from consistency, being the person who shows up the same way reliably over time until the pattern is simply undeniable. It comes from reciprocity, the deep human instinct to return what has been genuinely given. It comes from perceived credibility, being someone whose actual knowledge and actual track record speak for themselves, not someone who performs authority without the substance beneath it. Quiet, structural, patient. None of that is exciting, none of it makes for a good highlight reel. But it is what actually works, and it works because it is aligned with how people actually function rather than how they're supposed to function in a theory. And now the composed person in a tense room returns for the last time tonight. You already know this image, you've already felt it settle into place, but here it is one more time from a slightly different angle. The still person in a difficult moment is demonstrating in their body and their manner exactly what all of tonight's thinking has been pointing toward. They have, over time, built a relationship with their own interior that doesn't collapse when the exterior temperature changes. They are practicing, without naming it, Epictetus's dichotomy. They are embodying, without knowing the phrase, Sun Tzu's winning without fighting. They are not swinging the sword. They are simply not being available to the fight. They are demonstrating Nietzsche's self-overcoming in real time. The impulse to escalate, to match the room's intensity, is present, it is human, and they are choosing differently. And people in that room feel it. They feel it in their nervous systems before they can put a name to it, and they move toward it, not because the still person is performing, but because, in a world of reaction, genuine steadiness is rare enough to be remarkable. Let us take a breath here. Good. And now let us bring all of this home to the places where you actually live, to work first, because it is where most of us spend most of our waking hours, and where the question of power is most visibly, sometimes most painfully, present. There is almost always in any working environment a visible, loud version of power and a quieter version. The visible, loud version is easy to recognize. It announces itself, it dominates conversations, it makes sure the room knows it's there. And for a while, sometimes a long while, it can look like the only kind that matters, like the thing that actually determines who gets listened to and who doesn't. But over time, if you watch carefully, another pattern tends to emerge. The person who actually gets trusted with the important things, the things that actually matter, not just the things that look important, is often not the loudest person in the room. It is the person with the established pattern of being right, of being honest when honesty is uncomfortable, of being present when others are distracted or unavailable. The person whose consistency has made them a fixed point in an environment that is always shifting. Their influence isn't louder, it's deeper, and there's a warmth component that the research keeps finding. Susan Fiske and her colleagues, studying how we form judgments of other people, found that we do it along two dimensions almost universally. Warmth. Is this person on my side? Do they care? Are they safe? And competence. Are they capable? Can they actually do what they're here to do? Both matter, but the sequence matters too. Warmth is assessed first. Competence is only trusted when warmth has already been established. A person who leads with pure competence and no warmth tends to generate respect, but not loyalty. Respect is fragile, loyalty survives difficulty. The person at work who is quietly powerful is usually the person who has made others feel genuinely seen and genuinely supported, not as a tactic, but as a natural orientation, and who is also actually quietly excellent at what they do. Both together, not performed but real. You can carry this lightly, not as a to-do list, just as a way of understanding the room you're in and where the actual gravity is coming from. And then there is love. This is where the question of power gets most intimate and most tender, and where the distinction between power over and power to becomes most important. There is a version of love, and many people have experienced it either from the outside looking in or from the inside looking out, that is organized around a kind of ownership, around the need to know and control where the other person is and who they're with and what they're feeling, around using affection as leverage, giving it when the other person behaves in desired ways and withdrawing it when they don't, around the quiet insistence that the other person shrink, not because they're asked to directly, but because the atmosphere of the relationship makes growing feel threatening. This is power over. And in the context of love, it always corrodes. Always, not sometimes. It corrodes the thing it's trying to hold, because love held by control isn't love anymore, it's just control with love's name on it. The power to, Arendt's version, the one that arises between people rather than over them, looks entirely different in love. It is the power of two people who have chosen each other freely, who continue to choose each other freely, and who are made more themselves by the relationship rather than less. Where power over contracts, this expands. Where power over fears the other person's growth, this delights in it. The security of it doesn't come from certainty that the other person can't leave. It comes from the quality of the bond itself, renewed each day, worth choosing each day. And the person in that relationship who has genuinely done the inward work, who has enough self-respect to need no control over the other, enough self-knowledge to bring their actual self rather than a performance, enough steadiness to be a safe place for someone else's vulnerability. That person holds something in the relationship that has nothing to do with dominance, a kind of quiet presence that the other person can actually rest in. This is the love that the philosophers of power read past their caricatures were always pointing toward without quite using the word. Epictetus, who knew about freedom from the most extreme possible vantage point. Marcus trying to govern himself so that his relationships would have something real to stand on. Nietzsche insisting that self-respect that needs no enemy is the foundation of any genuine connection. You can hold this gently now, as possibility, not pressure. And among friends, here the dynamic is softer and perhaps more immediately recognizable. In any group of friends, any long-standing, genuine community of people who have chosen each other and keep showing up, there is usually someone around whom the quality of the group changes. Their presence makes the room easier. Their absence creates a different texture, something slightly less grounded. And when something goes wrong, when someone in the group is struggling or the group itself hits a rupture, everyone tends to look toward this person. They are rarely the most dominant, often not the loudest, almost never the one who claimed the most space or the most attention, but there is something stable in them that the group has learned over time to lean against. What makes them this? Usually it is the combination we have been circling all night: genuine warmth, the particular quality of actually caring about the people around them, not as a performance, but as a constant low hum of real interest and concern. Consistency, being the same person on Thursday that they were the Tuesday before and the Friday before that, so that people know what they're getting and have stopped needing to guard against surprises. And a kind of self-possession that doesn't need to be the center, that can hold back and give space, that generates rather than consumes. The quiet, generous one, the calm one, the person who, when conflict arrives, doesn't make it about themselves, who can carry a piece of someone else's weight without it being a transaction. Cialdini's findings about reciprocity are alive here in the most human possible way. People who give genuinely, not keeping score, not giving in order to receive, but actually contributing to the life of the group, those people find that the group gives back. Not always equally, not always immediately, but eventually, reliably, because we are wired for this, because generosity calls forth generosity in a way that demand never can, and the composure, always the composure. The friend who doesn't escalate when escalation is invited, who can hold a rupture without panicking about it, who trusts the bond to be durable enough to survive a difficulty. That steadiness is a kind of service to everyone around them, even if it never gets named. Sun Tzu said, "The highest skill is to win without fighting." Among friends, the translation is this: the person who holds the most genuine influence in a group is the one who has never had to fight for it, who never claimed it, who simply showed up consistently with warmth and presence and the quiet willingness to be useful until the authority was simply there, given freely, not taken. That is the whole teaching in a sentence. Take a slow breath all the way in, and then let it go. We have traveled a long way tonight, through cold camp tents and palace rooms and ancient river valleys, and the bitter years of exile and the notebooks of a sick, isolated philosopher who was trying, against everything, to think more clearly. And we have arrived, as all such journeys tend to arrive, back here, in this room, this night, you already lying down, already letting the day begin to recede. Let us gather the images we have walked through together. Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man in the known world, writing by lamplight to himself, asking how to be more patient, how to stay humble, how to keep the interior clean. He who commanded everything, turning each night to the only territory he considered genuinely his, the water on the stone, Lao Tzu's image, ancient and unimprovable, the softest thing in the world, the hardest stone, and given enough time, the softness wins, not through force, through persistence and nature and the simple fact of being entirely what it is. The greatest strategist who ever lived, teaching that the highest form of winning is the battle that never has to happen. The master who sheathes the sword, the positioning so careful and the self-knowledge so clear that conflict becomes unnecessary. The fallen exile in Florence, sitting in his garden in enforced idleness, writing down what he had learned by watching power from the inside and then from the outside, trying to say something true about how things actually worked, not how they were supposed to work. Machiavelli, who understood that reputation is a real force, that how you are perceived shapes what is possible, and who, beneath all the misquoting and the caricature, was really writing about the relationship between preparation and chance, between what we can control and what we must accept, between virtue and fortuna. The philosopher who was mistranslated by the sister who edited his notes after his death, whose real idea was not domination, but the hardest possible thing, the ongoing, daily, never-finished work of overcoming yourself. Nietzsche, who said that the strength that needs no enemy is the most genuine kind, who pointed at ressentiment not to shame you for it, but to show you that the energy locked in an old resentment is energy that could be yours again if you were willing to stop needing the grievance. And Epictetus, the freed slave, whose whole philosophy fits in 8 words. Some things are up to us. Some are not. You don't need to remember any of this. You don't need to carry it forward as a study plan or a list of principles to implement. If one image stayed with you tonight, just one, let that be enough. The water, the lamplight, the composure. The idea that letting go of a grudge is an act of strength. If that one thing settles somewhere and you return to it without even meaning to, some ordinary afternoon when the room is tense or the resentment is visiting again, or you find yourself wondering where your actual power is, then tonight will have done what it came to do. The most durable power in ordinary life is quiet. It doesn't announce, it doesn't demand. It grows in the dark, like most things that last, slowly and without performance. It is the power that comes from having built a relationship with your own interior that can hold difficulty without collapsing, that can give without keeping score, that can stay present without needing to dominate the room. You have more of this than you think. The very fact that you are here, in the dark, turning these questions over, that is itself a form of the inward work. Not grand, not dramatic, but real. The philosophers were here first, and they all came to the same quiet conclusion. The empire worth having is the one inside. One last sleepy beep before the dark. Good night.